let's talk to Kieran in London, who's done time in the US, in Australia, and in the UK, and is ready to give us a comparison. Kieran, very kind of you, I must say. Tell us.
Yeah, thank you, George. I've spent about 2 years in prison in the United States, Australia, and Ireland, and I've been going in and out of jail for 30 years, primarily for anti-war activity. 20 years ago, tomorrow, of course, this war on Iraq began with B-52 bombardment. And
Indeed.
2 weeks before that, we broke into an Air Force base in New York and put one out of action for the length of the war. Unfortunately, other B-52s from that base, Griffiths Air Force Base, were deployed to England and dropped their payloads of napalm, cluster bombs, and fuel air explosives.
Indeed, they did.
We were put in prison for 13 months. I was put on Con Air, flown from New York to Texas, to El Paso, and bussed up to Pecos. And I was the only white prisoner in the jail. There were 24 of us in a cage, 6 cages welded together, so about 140 men in one room. And that was run by a private company. And then I was transferred to Louisiana Penitentiary and then got the more traditional punishment of transportation to Australia at the end of that.
My goodness.
The first night I spent in prison in Australia, I was sharing a cell with a career armed robber who told me that people would stop robbing banks and banks stop robbing people, which I thought was very insightful, because what it points to is there's 2 sorts of crime in our world. There's wholesale theft and murder and dealing in dangerous substances. And then there's retail versions of that. And most people you meet in jail aren't in there for heroically rebelling against capitalism. They're actually in there for mimicking the mainstream standards of killing and thieving and dealing that people in society based on peace and justice, and that people are offending against that. Where actually they're mimicking the criminal behaviour of the ruling elites. And
I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy, as you would expect, for much of what you said. Well, a lot of what you said there, Kieran. But
yeah.
let's as it were, put our feet down in the real world just for a minute on this. If your house or your neighbour's house is broken into by a violent criminal this evening, God forbid, and your family terrified, and your no doubt meagre belongings stolen by that person.
Yeah.
We have to have a policy about what we're going to do about that one person and that one crime. It won't do just to say, well, that's just what capitalism does on a bigger scale.
Oh, no, I'm with a group called the Catholic Worker Movement, and we look after people who are quite addicted and quite violent, and we actually open the door to them rather than have them break in. And we've had to deal with lots of situations. You know, many of them are combat veterans, and especially in the United States, Vietnam vets and stuff, and are quite traumatized and act out. And I've never called a cop in 30 years, so I think it's a huge mistake to put all these people with these problems, whether they be addictions or pedophilia or violence, all in one place, to start a kind of school for them in prison.
Don't you think that there are bad people in the world, Kieran?
I think there's some people possibly who are quite psychotic, and you'd have to well, you know, for a Christian, it's not about punishing people, it's about stopping the next offence, and putting them in one place in a penitentiary or a prison together to develop a subculture of violence and you know, whatever they develop is a mistake. I mean, maybe there's some role for house arrests for people who are quite psychotic, but I think the best forms I've seen in dealing with offences is actually coming from Maori culture in New Zealand, where they have a restorative justice process. And I remember seeing a documentary on women who'd been raped as children, confronting their perpetrators like 20 or 30 years later. And that made more sense to me than putting someone in jail for 16 years for rape. You know, most rapes go unreported. The ones that do don't end in convictions. And that's an enormous crime in our society that's not addressed, and it's not really addressed by the criminal justice system either.
Okay, Kieran in London from the Catholic Workers Movement, a very challenging point of view on the issues of crime and punishment, which are part of our agenda for this evening. If you've got a point of view on what you've heard from Peter Hitchens, or from Kieran for that matter, then call us